If you wait 10 minutes for a full professor, you should wait 10 for Nick, but he's here. Anyway, I'm Jeff Rothbard, president of Class of 72. It's my privilege to introduce my friend at one of the university's great treasures, Nick Spitzer. He's the moderator of this morning's panel, Our Back Pages. It would take me more time than it's allotted to me to list all of Nick's accomplishments in the fields of anthropology, folklore, and music. Nick is, or Dr. Spitzer, is a cum laude graduate from the college where he majored in both anthropology and folklore. He received his master's and doctorate in anthropology and folklore from the University of Texas. He is currently a professor, fully tenured professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Tulane. However, Nick's really best known for hosting his weekly radio station on a public radio show, American Roots, which premiered in 1997 and is syndicated by 225 stations. For 2 hours each week, Nick explores how music reflects the time and place and culture of a particular area. His show is listened to by an audience of over 500,000 listeners every week. Since you didn't come to Houston Hall to hear me speak in the rain for sure, I want to introduce you to the great Nick Spitzer.
Boy, if I'd known I was going to get that formal an introduction, I've done that for everybody here, but I'm not. Maybe it's just because somebody's handed me one of their inventions from that era. This is the toss and toke frisbee. I thank Dorian Dale, so that sort of put me. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're the head of marketing. That's right. And I think if you act now, there still are a few of these in stock. We'll talk about that later. But we also have, of course, a little bit of current moment politics that's been emerging. Actually, Dorian, you're responsible for both the frisbee and this. I don't know if you can read that, but I think he'll send this to you if you want to make your own T-shirt. Anyway, why don't I just pass this around? In a world of digital, I think sometimes just an analog is good, just to pass things out. I have to admit, after thinking about this for about 45 years, I feel almost at a loss for words today. And it's because just seeing people and talking to people, it just takes you back to the much more the human emotional experience of knowing people and being in a place. And so all the things that I thought I would say and could say and have rehearsed saying have just sort of gone by the wayside in a way. And I'm glad these guys are here because they're all really great talkers. Let me just say this. I came from a small town, Old Lyme, Connecticut. My mother wanted me to go to Yale. I went down there. I had a couple bad experiences when I was a Cub Scout, where guys got in fights in the stands and were drunk, and that sticks with you, And then a little later, during the beginning of the big anti-war movement, where I was on board with it as a kid, but I went down there and it just seemed so dour. It was so close to me, and you know how these things are. I just didn't want to be near my parents anymore, and Penn was as far as they'd let me go. And anyway, it was an interesting moment for me to come from a small town and be here. And when I think of we are the class that straddles 68 to 72. We have 2 years in each of the decades. Now, in actuarial terms, that isn't, or calendar terms, it's not that meaningful. But it does seem interesting to me that we had that experience in these high times. And I saw somebody throw a Molotov cocktail at College Hall. I understood the angst and the anger. I didn't want to see College Hall burned. I called the fire department. And then for the next 6 months, I was visited by the Philadelphia police at my door, which was not a whole lot of fun. But what I was driving at, and being in the big city and at Penn, was it just was overwhelming to me for about a semester of how intense people could be, how competitive they could be, how things seemed to be changing every day. The Vietnam War was raging. Everything just seemed to be new and fresh every day and jaw-dropping to me. And I assume this was true for other people. I was also amazed that there were people who were just playing pinball all day. In fact, some of those may be in the room right now. Thinking particularly of Peter Rothstein, but there are others, the late, great pinball wizard. I thought, how can you play pinball all day? You know, I mean, I had a little bit of New England Puritanism in me that thought, you can't play pinball all day. And then I got, you know, the guys come up to me on the floor and said, oh yeah, we were tripping last week. And I'm like, what? You know, so to me, it was really, you know, a fall from the Garden of Eden to the extent of small town in Connecticut. It seemed that way. All that said, I feel very strongly that many of the ideas and things that I gained being a student here in anthropology and doing WXPN have stood with me for many, many years. What was I doing when I left Penn? Anthropology and radio. You know, I went to WMMR. What could get a job? What kind of job do you get with a BA in anthropology? Well, it could be a waiter or a lifeguard, but it had already been those. But I could do radio. And what do I do all these years later at Tulane? Anthropology and radio. And so somehow something right must have happened. But the radio side of it, I just do want to say that, and my voice is terrible. We've been at cocktail parties shouting, and it's not the best form. But you know, when I was a student opening up to this world that was all around me in Philadelphia, I started going to the Aqua Lounge at 45th and Locust, where John Coltrane's old band was performing on a regular basis. So I'm seeing these African-American guys, half of them in dashikis, the other half in like super narrow suits with thin ties. Super intellectual, super spiritual, super cool. So I go to the anthropology department and say, I think I want to work with African-Americans in Philly. And they said, well, you know, we don't do that. You have to work with, you know, East Africa or West Africa, the newer, or maybe the Senegambia world, the Wolof. And I'm thinking, nah, I want to work with friggin' African-Americans in Philadelphia. You know, this is not the culture I know, but I was listening to Sam Cooke and Otis Redding as performed in rural Connecticut by Sicilians. And they were the transfer agents. And now I'm ready to jump in. You know, I'd heard the Beach Boys singing, and you could go barbershop quartet in one direction with them, or you could go Chuck Berry. Well, I went Chuck Berry. And then I thought, well, how the hell did Chuck Berry become like that? How could that be? Who are these people out there making this incredible vernacular culture? Whether the high-minded spiritualists of the African American Jazz Club, or down in South Philly singing doo-wop on the corners, you know, Sicilians on one corner and African American on the other corner on that bound line along Bainbridge and South Street. Actually, we walked down there the other day. So anyway, the anthro guy says to me, well, you go to sociology. You get that in sociology. So I go to sociology, and they said, well, we're doing like household violence, infant mortality, matrifocal family, dependency. I said, well, I'm going to see these cats like making the most incredible music, or I'm down in the corner with people singing about, you know, the God, and you're telling me it's all about trial, trouble, and trauma, and everyone's broken down? That's not who I'm seeing. I'm seeing this transcendent world. And so somehow I finally thought, well, American studies, but it seemed like all Mark Twain and Weathervanes and Barnes to me. And I'm thinking, you know, what about jazz? Well, I met a guy named John Zwed. I took his jazz and blues class, like some of you took that. I did XPN, and I really was starting to balance the notion that even though in the archives at the anthropology library we had the human relations area files, they're all typed on, you know, 3x5 file cards. This is before, obviously, data entry. You're comparing cards, you know, about traits, but it was dead, it was traits. But at XPN there was a wall of records, and the wall of records had everything from, you know, pygmy marriage ceremonies to Oceania to the blues. And somebody filed the Zydeco records in the Caribbean section. And I was going for reggae, and I said, well, who is this cat, Clifton Shearer? Listen to it. I said, well, this must be from Martinique or Haiti or somewhere. No, Louisiana. So on the wall of the record library is where I began to do the larger world ethnography and American cultural ethnography that really I could never have gotten in the anthropology department. Certainly couldn't have gotten in sociology where everything was broken, and how we're going to fix it, we don't know, but we'll just document how broken it is. And little by little, in this world of discovery, you find your way. And, you know, and I stopped thinking judgmentally about the pinball players. In fact, Peter Rossi went on to an incredible career in business. And, you know, I began to realize that when people find a passion for something or do something that they really want to do, they can make that happen. But when you're around a lot of really creative people at a time when politics, culture, and art and society just seems to be changing every day. Gee, is that right now? I guess it really is, actually, when I think about it, and it goes forward. But when you're around those people in this environment, and in university, I have an enormous pride in because of its deep sense of engagement. Didn't always agree with everything. Obviously, nobody does, but I really admire Penn's enduring sense of engagement. And I still battle with that sense of engagement at my university, where there really isn't that much in any of our departments. And we're just beginning to do service learning post-Katrina. And so, with that said, I want to refer to the notion of the BMOC. Everyone knows what that meant. Notice there was no W in that. The big man on campus. I heard about the BMOC when I was a freshman. A couple of them, hey, Worm, what you doing tonight? You know, I mean, this kind of, you get cat calls from like BMOC occasionally. But there were some benevolent BMOCs. And one of my favorite was Ira Harkavik. I'd see him walking around with this multicolored vest. I'd go to, various things, where he'd be out in front of the Franklin statue with a bullhorn talking about the Vietnam War and the spice and rack and everything. And I was so impressed that somebody would actually step forward in front of a crowd and do these things and say these things. And it all sounded very logical to me and powered by passion. I can't quite pretend to unthread all the different things Ira has been doing over the years. I've been reading documents about public policy in hospitals. The service learning stuff is the model, in my opinion, for how it's done. You can actually integrate academic work with service work, and you come out having worked in cultures and communities in the city. And you also end up, I think, being very employable because you know how to deal with nonprofits, you know what the issues are, and it's just a fabulous thing. But in our last reunion 5 years ago, I had to quote something. There was an article about Ira in the in-house faculty staff newsletter about his life and his career, and with the Netter Center and with service learning and all the good things that he's done. And the title was a quote from him quoting the Grateful Dead, and it said, "What a long, strange, but productive trip it's been." And I thought, that sounds a little funny, but you know what? That's right. It's about the mystery, the journey, the trip, the travel, but productive. Let's take care of the social order. Let's be engaged. Let's do something that's good for the people we came up with, but also the people we never knew before. And let's take this university to another level in terms of the engagement with people living culture. So some kid won't have to go to anthropology, be sent to sociology, be sent to American studies and say, hey, there's nothing here for you, I'll go to the jazz clubs. I'm not saying we should. We still got to go to the jazz clubs. We still got to go where things move us to find things. But it sure helps to have somebody like Ira Harkavy here. And so Ira, I've skipped titles, I've skipped the grand resume. I wish he hadn't done that. But it's okay. It's okay, Jeff. You're the president. You can do whatever you want. Presidents do whatever they want nowadays. Ira,
thank you.
You, sir.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I must note that I'm the oldster in this room. I graduated in 1970, so I didn't straddle 2 decades. I was right squarely in the 1960s. I went to Penn and graduated in 1970, as I said, and then they kept me here. I did end up doing my PhD here, and I stayed at the University of Pennsylvania. It's some time away, which I'll talk about briefly. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Nick and I have been in touch over the years. He hosted me twice in Tulane.
Right.
That's right. And that's me when I was younger and had hair. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So what Nick asked me to just chat about was some things that influenced my life having gone to Penn during the period I went to Penn. First thing I want to say is I wouldn't have traded that experience for anything in the world. It shaped my life. For good or ill, it made me what I am today and what I do today. I came to Penn in 1966. I was going to go to Cornell. I was driving to Cornell with my father. We were in a severe snowstorm. We only got as close as Hobart William Smith. I said to my parents, I want to go to the best school I can get into, south of New York City. I can tell I'm from New York from the way I talk, although I've been living here since 1966. But so I decided, got into Penn. I knew nothing about it. I came to Penn. I found it initially very quiescent and quiet campus and not very engaged. I had been I was somewhat engaged in high school. My parents were activists. My passions at the time was sports and politics. Even then, I had demonstrated against the Vietnam War before coming to Penn. And as I remember things that shaped my life very directly, and just a few events, I became very active in anti-war and issues of Penn's treatment of the West Philadelphia community. And events I remember that kind of signal how it shaped my thinking. I became head of the canvassing committee in Philadelphia to elect Gene McCarthy president of the United States. And I had a guy living with us, someone illegally in the dorm, who was the organizer for the city and the state. His name was Howard. That's all I remember about him. He was mysterious. He came in and out of the room at all odd hours, passing out leaflets. I meet him downtown. He was the guru of this. And I remember one event very, very much. It was March 31st, 1968. When Lyndon Johnson, because he did relatively poorly, he received 49% of the vote in New Hampshire. McCarthy surprised the world with 42%, and Lyndon Johnson said he would not run again for president of the United States. And the spontaneity of Penn's campus, of people just demonstrating and coming out and marching to City Hall in the sense that politics can make a difference, really. There was not a reason to be optimistic about young people helping to change the world. And then 1968, 9, my junior year, I took a course with someone who changed my life. His name is Lee Benson. He's one of the great historians. I'm an historian and I teach history, urban studies, Africana studies at Penn and also in School of Education. And Lee Benson was an activist from another generation, the 30s and 40s, and Lee said, why study history? And everyone went around the room and they said, well, study history because history repeats itself, and past is prelude. And he said, you study history to understand the world in order to change the world for the better. And I remember that class as if it was yesterday, before yesterday. It just began me to think about these ideas, that you could study things to make a difference in the world. And then, for a variety of reasons, as an activist, I was actually, there's been a book written about this now called Becoming Penn, not about that, but significantly about this period of Penn's relationship with the community in the 60s and going forward. I was anointed by other activists to lead the College Hall sit-in of the spring of 1969, and that was a very intense period. It was a period in which, at 19 years old, I had a lot of responsibilities, probably a greater responsibility than any period in my life. I was asked to head the sit-in. I was surrounded by ultra-lefties who wanted to create violence on Penn's campus, wanted to crack heads. There was an insane group called the SDS Labor Committee, whose head was a guy named Lynn Marcus, who became Lyndon LaRouche, and he became a fascist. You can't hear me? His name was Lynn Marcus, and he was the head of SDS Labor Committee, and he was ultra-left, and then he became head. He was an older guy, at least older from my standpoint then. He's probably younger than I am now. But he then became Lyndon LaRouche, and became a Nazi. Became a Nazi. And they threatened me at times, and my great fear was on the other side also. These ultra-leftists, and Frank Rizzo was going to come in and crack our heads. And I worked with a guy, George Fensel, who was the head of civil defense, CDI, what is it called?
Civil disobedience.
Disobedience. And he was a very nice guy. And he actually said to me and to African American leaders that you got to keep this peaceful and you got to get out of there soon. If you don't get out of that building soon, there's going to be violence. We were there for 6 days and 6 nights, working with the community, with the trustees. And that picture, not that one, but it was another, that's me also, I also had long hair, but at least half. The picture you had earlier was the picture of the last night of that sit-in. And we had an incredible agreement. Fraternity, head of IFC, the head president of the senior class, people who are still my friends. Actually, I just saw the president of my senior class in California when I was doing development work for my center in Penn last week. And members of the African American community, large numbers of Penn students, all supporting the position. And then the ultra-leftists brought in a phony leader who they claimed was the head of the Black Panthers, who was from nowhere. And the demonstration was about to explode. Students weren't going to sign on. Community members weren't going to sign on. And it was the smell of violence was in the air. And the picture you see there, one of the African American leaders and another They came and organized, brought leadership from the city. They brought in the real head of the Black Panthers, his name at the time was Reggie Shell, and other African American leaders who weren't that militant. They say, we stand with the students. I'll never forget that. And they said that we stand with the students, and the ultra-leftists were ridden out, and we marched out of that building. I had the greatest relief of my life, I think. And at the same time, we had something about the issue that democracy is the process, justice will be the end. There was no violence. There was no violence. There was none of the insanity of Columbia and the weather and Mark Rudd. There was no violence. And Penn then became a model. Last statement, and then I'll conclude how it shaped my life. And I had become the head at that period of a community organization linked to Penn. It also was related to that called the Community Involvement Council. It was the largest volunteer organization, did tutoring, did work on anti-racism, worked with the African American community, and that fit because that demonstration wasn't just about Vietnam, it was about Penn's terrible treatment of the West Philadelphia community, which up until that time had been terrible treatment of the West Philadelphia community. And the last story, then I'll return to that, was sitting in 1970 at a lunch that my professor, Lee Benson, would have for his honors students. We were sitting in the Moravian Cafe, and in the middle of lunch, this was out of almost set in the movie, a student comes in and says, Cambodia has been bombed. I remember how all of us got up, we thanked our professor who had been an activist, and we all left and went to organize. The nature of how much that focus of our experience. So if I look back and think about how Penn shaped me, I left Penn briefly and did community work and went to law school at night. I was a terrible organizer and I wasn't a very happy law student. So I went back to Penn to get my PhD in history, and the lessons I learned from that my field connects to that. Mine wasn't interested in doing regular history. I was interested, as my professor said, history to help understand the world, to change it. And I then went into a career in which I could do that. I also remember as an activist, when I came back to Penn as a graduate student, all that we were doing, all that community engaged work had disappeared, or was weak, it was attenuated. And I decided that we needed to do something else, and that something else was to build into the academic work of Penn, academically based community service that involves Penn and the community academically. And now we have 70 courses this year, 1,700 undergraduates who are taking courses linking Penn and the community, and about 400 additional volunteers on how to improve Penn in the community. And the last statement to connect all the stories, the thing I recognized also from that experience was how you can work to produce change. And in fact, working to produce change meant hard organizing, hard thinking, and integrating, if you can, your avocation with your vocation. And I thank Penn every day. I never would have done what I've done without it. And as Nick said, Penn has been the best institution I can think of that engages with the community and makes a difference in the world. So 1966 to 70 changed my life, and I think for the better. Thank you.
All right. As I said, I think the community service approach here to service learning is really fascinatingly better than most of what's being done everywhere. It's so much more of a dialogue and so much less of it just will help the little people solve their problems, which is where I see it all too often, especially at private universities. One note on the police chief and later Mayor Rizzo. I remember his idea of community policing. He was on like WFIL talking around the time of some of these activities, and he said, and he was speaking specifically of gangs in Philadelphia, African American gangs, and he said, you know, if the gangs want to fight, the police department will meet them wherever they want, and we'll have that fight. I mean, that was community policing. Kick everyone's butt.
Community policing.
Yeah, right, exactly. And then when some of the the Cambodia march that night, it was a pretty rough night. Some of you probably went downtown. About 10,000 people between Penn, Drexel, University City, West Philly. And I mean, there were some bottles flying around and pushing and shoving, and the cops were all lined up in the vans and buses, and it felt explosive to me that night. And I think a couple days later, he said something like, you know, if the students at Penn want to fight, we'll fight them right at Penn. We'll fight them at Franklin Field. Well, wherever we're, you know, and again, we're back to this just feudalistic, fascist view of community policing and solving problems. I want to shift gears to a person who I think of as somebody of peace and has worked in some ways, arguably, in a different direction from what I refer to the BMOC. And you know, there were certainly many women who were incredibly influential here and very public about their interests in arts, culture, and politics. So we should have made that amendment a long time ago to the acronym. But Jane Tanaskovic Brady is somebody I just really knew a little bit at a distance. You were at XPN for a while hosting Classical. And I just, you know, I'd hear you here and there in classes and various things, and I thought, you know, I'd read somewhere that you'd been involved with the Audubon Society, and I'm from a family of bird watchers. But moreover, I also saw that, you know, later in life you transitioned after fundraising for a variety of nonprofits to the cloth, as we used to say, and became an Episcopal minister. And it struck me that everybody here has been in words. You know, Ira's been a speaker and a narrator, and he's written policy documents and worked, you know, out in the world, linking his philosophy and his passions to order and words and programming. David, who we'll hear from, obviously, is a celebrated writer. We have a distinguished poet, and I think that sometimes we forget that in the old school of Protestantism, words were very, very important, and still are, as far as the great Sunday sermon. And helping communities understand their values and live their lives. And so I'm always so impressed by what Jane's done. I mentioned the Audubon Society. He worked for HYY for a while, raising funds for Columbia, New Jersey Audubon, 19 years. Working with older adults, interfaith relations. And I really admire the fact that she's kept research interests like looking into the work of the Welsh poet and priest R.S. Thomas, serving on the board of the U.S. Friends of Gladstone's Library. I assume that's in London? No?
Wales.
Oh, in Wales. Sorry, that's of course. And it's really amazing to me the way she's been able to mingle concern for the environment with concern for the spiritual world. And I'll just mention in September she's beginning a clinical pastoral education residency at Albany Medical Center and study in the field of bioethics. So this is somebody who's been a long-term intellectual, but deeply engaged in important issues of the human spirit and human community. Jane Brady.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
I don't know how it is for you at reunions. I tried to get to a WXPN reunion probably 15 or 20 years ago, and I got stuck in traffic on the Garden State Parkway. And after 2 hours, I was only in Newark, and I realized I'd never get there. So anyway, it's good to be here. I can tell you I was at my second fraternity party last night. So I don't know how it is for you, but when I've looked at all of the names of people who've been coming here for the reunion, you know, most of you I don't know. And I'm thinking, well, you know, I had friends when I was here. So I'm sort of the opposite of the big man on campus. I mean, most people don't know me, but anyway, I've gotten to know Jeff Rothbard and Susan in the last couple of years, and just to thank you, Jeff, for the amazing work that you did for our class and for the university. And I know that you had a committee working with you. I know Margaret Ryan, who has been kind of my touchstone for Penn, my contacts with Penn, as has Greg Johnson. I don't know if you know Greg Johnson. He's part of the development department of the university. Lovely man, not a Penn graduate, but he comes to New Jersey. I live in New Jersey, now in the Philadelphia, Trenton, Princeton sphere. I grew up in North Jersey near the George Washington Bridge in New York City. But Jeff comes and we have lunch every couple of years. And so he's kept me informed about Penn and and Amy Gutman and all the wonderful things that are happening here. And he is interested enough in me that he's now reading the Welsh poet and priest R.S. Thomas. So, I mean, what a good development person, right? I mean, that's brilliant. So I'm glad that Nick mentioned the environmental aspect of my work. I'm just wondering, how many of you are in second careers?
Second,
How about third? Third, okay.
What's a career?
Great. I am, when I was here, it was not an easy time in my life at Penn. I mean, I was grateful for the professors. They were, most of them, extraordinary. I started out in the General Honors Program. I felt completely unprepared for that. I had come from a small Roman Catholic girls' school in New York City and was really unprepared for the diversity of Penn, but it was something that I always sought out. My best friend was from high school was a student at Barnard, and I would visit her the first couple of years she was there, and every time I would go there, I thought, boy, I'm glad I'm at Penn. You know, there seemed to be room for everyone here. And I'm glad that Nick and Ira, sorry, I knew who you were, but didn't get to know you, mentioned two things that have been really significant for me. One of them is finding your way. And I'm someone who's still finding my way, and I think that Penn has given me the gifts to find my way. And to my surprise, not my surprise, my delight, Ira, you mentioned vocation. And when I was here at Penn, I very much felt a call to a religious vocation, but because of my my contacts with being a Roman Catholic, I didn't have a way to do that. I'd had difficult relationships with Roman Catholic sisters, and that was the only option for me as a woman. So it took a long time for me to figure out that I belonged in a different denomination. Eventually I found the Episcopal Church when I was 30, and that's been a spiritual home for me, except for the 10 years I was Presbyterian because of my late husband. But Frederick Buechner, I don't know if you know Frederick Buechner, he's kind of been okay, good, there's one person.
Only the Episcopalians.
He's actually Presbyterian, but he hangs out with, talks a lot about vocation, and that's been kind of a central sort of focus for me, and that was part of my problem. I couldn't embody my vocation or even discern it, partly because I was a woman, you know, and when I think back, like how much things have changed. I mean, they've changed incredibly. And it was actually in Philadelphia where the first ordination of women in the Episcopal Church took place in '74, I think it was, Philadelphia 11. And it was sort of an out of the ordinary ordination, but that at least gave me a way forward. But anyway, Buechner talks about vocation as finding that place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. And when you are someone who's not living in the truth of who you are, it's hard to find your deep gladness. So it took me a while to find that. But Penn has just, I think I'm also a great advocate of liberal arts education because it enables us to move around a lot and to focus on things besides doing the next deal. But we need all of you in all your different spheres. Thinking about my environmental work, I mean, I'm somebody who kind of backed into things or found them, but process theologian Alfred North Whitehead talked about the nature of God, and it's not a definition, but he describes it as tender care that nothing be lost. And so when I look back on my life, I see all these different pieces and sort of parts of journeys that I didn't fully embody, but somehow they have a way of circling around. I spent, after Penn and working for Channel 12 for 5 years, and grateful for continuing contacts with WXPN people there. Howard Lesser was in the class before me, but he was the one who got me started in the classical music area of XPN. Anyway, I spent a year at Columbia studying African history, and was interested in the interactions of East Africa and the Indian Ocean, and spent a semester trying to learn Arabic, and it was the most humbling thing that I and so I gave it up with kind of sort of a sense of shame, and I couldn't do this, and I suffer from writer's block, and yet so here I'm in a profession where I have to come up with a sermon every week, you know. So there are all these ironies, but so I gave that up, and years later I was at Princeton Seminary, where I had to learn Greek and Hebrew, you know, ironic, but I got through that. And a sense that if you can find your vocation, then God or the Spirit, however you refer to that other power, that primary power, is going to find a way to equip you to do that. So we can all celebrate that. So years later, I'm at Princeton Seminary, and John Mbiti, who's the premier theologian of African religion, I read was coming to Princeton Seminary for the year as a visiting scholar, and I introduced myself to him because I knew who he was from my failed year at Columbia, and he's become one of my closest and dearest friends along with his wife. So coming here and realizing all these connections and maybe false starts, and they all have a way of being made into a whole, and a blessing of that. Now there's something about the environmental part. There's something circling around. How many of you are on Facebook? Well, I guess Facebook might be passé at this point, but I haven't gotten on to Twitter. But there's something circling around now about, you name your 10 concerts.
Oh, God.
And then you're trying to guess which one you weren't present for. And so I haven't done that. I'm thinking, surely there's going to be sometime a best 10 art exhibits, and I'm starting that list. But anyway, when we think about the 10 kind of significant life events, Ira, you started talking about some of them for you here, and Nick, you also. Certainly, during my years at Penn, there was Earth Day. Right. And Philadelphia, how many of you were involved in that? You were here.
We got the Earth Day button right here.
Oh, wonderful.
Wearing it, yeah, designed.
That's Mary, I was on the Earth Week committee. I was the undergraduate representative.
Yeah.
Well, that was one of those events that I happened to miss.
Oh.
And it just took a while for me to connect with that. But I do have a little story. One of my apartment mates, Nadine Brokaw, who's a veterinarian here now, she was involved. And I remember she came back one day and said she was working with the committee, so maybe with you and others here. And she was typing a letter, and she realized she made a mistake, so she took it out of the typewriter, rolled it up in a ball, and realized, oh, I'm not supposed to do this. You know, this is part of the problem here. So, so that was a lesson for me, and that was a start. That was a seed that led to my 19 years with the New Jersey Audubon Society. People have a lot of prejudices about my home state, but it's actually a wonderfully, yes, a wonderfully diverse state and site of one of the key migrations avian migrations throughout North America. And I'm proud of that. And New Jersey is very subtle. But I think my work there for 19 years also shows that we are to kind of dig in wherever we are, you know, be responsible about that place and get to know and love that place. And when I saw that David Bradley was one of the panelists, I vaguely knew David, but have read his two his two novels with great, they're wonderful. And it's been many years, but I do remember from this Cheney'sville incident a description of the main character going deer hunting. Now, I spent my work with the environment in the kind of green side of it, not the pollutant side, so the kind of tree huggers side. But David had one of the best senses of place that I've encountered in anything that I have read. And I was working with people who were watching birds and preserving habitat, and then there were the hunters, and how do you justify that? And I couldn't do that myself. But thanks to David, I developed such an appreciation for the subtlety and of being in a particular environment, of listening for the wind, of seeing the light, of just being so deeply attuned. And when you approach anything that you do with that kind of love and that mindfulness, it can't be wrong. So thank you to David, and I'm sure if I got to talk to all of you, I would get other senses of that subtlety and love, and the digging in wherever you are. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
And we will open this up a little bit more as the morning progresses here. I like the notion of these. Everyone seems to be telling traffic tales of not getting somewhere, but ending up in a place that was satisfactory and more than satisfactory, and making it a place that you could be and should be. And I do want to come back to Jane on the questions of Penn not having a divinity school, the kind of school it was in terms of how people thought about the spirit or shed old ideas of religion. But rather than do that, I want to segue to the person that she mentioned. I did not know David Bradley myself. I'd heard about him, and one of the good things about reunions is that actually I've met a lot of people through the reunions that I really never knew at Penn, and I've enjoyed that greatly because it sort of extends the community. And David is one of them, and I like him so far. But I haven't said anything. I was basing it on our email last night. Jane mentioned the Cheney'sville incident, which I did read a long time ago, and I never did get to read South Street, but I'm working on that now. But beyond all those things, I'm just amazed what a man of words he is, both on the page and simply talking. And talking is not always that simple, as we have learned over time. Recently I did read an essay titled A Eulogy for Nigger, which was awarded the 2015 Notting Hill Edition's Essay Prize. It's very, very provocative. It's funny. It's sad. It's all the things that life can be. Having worked at quite a bit since those days when I couldn't get the anthropology department to let me do what I wanted, I have spent an enormous amount of time in rural African American communities, urban communities, producing this and that and the other thing. And this essay is so familiar with the deep vernacular and the ironies of life in the contemporary world. I highly recommend it to everybody. And if you don't mind, we can forward it to people who want, or they can find it.
It's online.
Yeah. Okay. Good. David has worked in a realm that I think is the realm. I only wish I could do all the things that he's been doing. Creative nonfiction. I think that is the way to go these days, and he's written for the biggies. New York Times, of course, The Nation, Los Angeles Times, New Yorker, Philadelphia Magazine, Pennsylvania Gazette. He's also worked in the realm of American literature, writing introductions to works by Melville Twain, Richard Wright, Edmund Wilson, and many others. He was a co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Civil Rights in America. Also working on The Sport of the Gods and other essential writings of Paul Lawrence Dunbar. BA in creative writing from here at Penn, an MA in United States Studies. I love that program name, United States Studies. Yeah. It's a fascinating title, and that's at the University of London. He's taught at Temple, Colgate, MIT, William and Mary, UT Austin, Michener Center, mainly I think University of Oregon. Has received a Guggenheim support from the National Endowment for the Arts over the years, and this man has has got it going on. Born in Western Pennsylvania and lives in La Jolla, California. David Bradley.
Good morning. It's a little after 7 for me, so and I have to have a script, so like don't get scared. It's not that. I just want to know. I didn't realize I was on a panel with at least 3 African Americanists. Gee, I asked Nick for an assignment. I want to just tell you what the assignment was. Given the turn of politics in recent years, I thought we should have a conversation for alumni and the Penn community that addresses what the knowledge gained in social action of the 1960s and 1970s can tell us today. That was my assignment, and I'm a writer, so I always write to assignment, okay? So, of course, like everyone, I'm going to start out talking about how I got to Penn. This is August 1967, and I get on a Greyhound bus in Bedford, Pennsylvania, which is 200 miles that way. Oh, God. That's the yearbook, right? Did not, I made him swear he was not going to use the freshman director.
Yeah, I changed my mind. Oh, that's not the freshman.
That's not the
director.
freshman,
Yeah, right,
but
right,
thank
yeah.
God. But Bedford is a small town, and there are not a lot of. I came to Penn. I didn't know that much about the place. I knew it called itself Penn because it called itself Penn, even though it said it was founded by Benjamin Franklin. I knew it was non-sectarian, but its teams were called the Quakers, but a football team called
Fighting
the Quakers.
Quakers.
Yeah, the Fighting Quakers. Okay, fine, whatever. I knew that it was never to be confused with Penn State because it was private, not public, and in the Ivy League, which meant intellectually and financially it was probably out of mind. I would never have thought of going to Penn if a recruiter hadn't visited my high school. Our guidance counselor said he probably got off the turnpike at the wrong exit. Or if that recruiter hadn't emphasized the importance of SAT scores over the prestige of the school that you attended and who you knew. I would never have applied once I found out what the tuition was if the recruiter hadn't talked about need-based financial aid. 1 year's tuition room and board was about $2,500. Doesn't sound like much now, does it?
No.
I'd never thought of my family as being poor. We had a nice house with central heating and indoor plumbing, and a lot of people in my community did not have those things. But my father was a minister, a Methodist. When you all evolve, you will become Methodists. But he made it, he was lucky if he pulled down $5,000 a year. I had a job. I was getting paid $1.10 an hour. I'd gotten a raise. The recruiter made what he thought were reassuring noises about a loan and a job and thought, and I'm thinking, but I'd been warned by Scripture. The borrower is servant to the lender. I wasn't borrowing money. I wouldn't have blown $11 on a bus ticket if the recruiter hadn't sent a postcard saying that my board scores look pretty good. I should maybe come down for a visit. The first part of that visit was a lecture about what a great guy Penn Franklin was. Well, we won't get into that, right? I go up and I read the inscription on that. I'm going, oh man. But it was delivered by a student who was tricked out in like colonial garb and everything, little Ben Franklin glasses and everything. And then he got us on a campus tour, and I'm thinking, who is this guy? But along the way, he explained that he was in Kite and Key, and that there was a society, and that the costume was part of the activity. Oh, okay, all right, I'm getting it now. I'm figuring that. At least we don't have to wear beanies. The tour included the library, and I walked into the library, and I looked at all those books, and I said, I'm allowed to read any of them? They said, yes. They said, you can go upstairs, take it down, read it. I took down books that nobody had read for years. I'm saying, I don't want to come to this place. I got to come to this place. The trouble was money. But during the campus tour, the guy said there was a ritual that people at Penn went through when they needed mercy or luck. And they would go down and put a penny on Benjamin Franklin's grave. So I said, okay, so I asked directions down to the burial ground. You couldn't actually get into it. But there was a little space in the thing where you could actually lean through, and there was this thing there with all these pennies. So I'm thinking, okay, so here's my penny. And I sat there and I was feeling hopeless and helpless because I'd never wanted anything before, anything positive. I'd always wanted out, but I didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't thinking I want to go to this place, but I'd also been taught that you wanted something, you worked for it, and you saved for it. There was no way I could earn it. There was no way I could ever save enough for it. All I could do was pray for it. In the 1960s, equal opportunity got defined. What got defined as getting rid of artificial barriers like law and customs and what everybody did, and the signs that you saw and the signs that they didn't have to put up because everybody knew. Supposedly those things are gone. But there are so many barriers that still remain. I spent 35 years teaching in universities. Most of the time, actually, I was at Temple, which is a whole different thing. But there were policies that were adopted that were supposed to get rid of those barriers. And they sort of ran out of steam when people started talking about equality of outcome, when they actually thought that things were going to change and it was going to be visible. The numbers became threatening. The changes became worrisome. We now live in a society that seems to be changing faster than a lot of people can stand, and they are scared to death. That's something that started to happen. We need to be aware of it. But that financial barrier remains. And I walk around and I wonder, and now I see what things cost, and I wonder what would happen to me now? Is there any chance that I could come to this place? I don't know, maybe not. I want to talk about the importance of guidance. Not just for a college that you go to, but what's available to you in your life. I talk to people and they're amazed at the possibility. I never would have thought about an ivy. I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was the way your pants were. There was a style. Yeah. You can't work for something and exercise discipline unless you know that it's there, that there's something that you need. And that guidance counselor gave me focus, gave me hope, gave me a chance, as did the SATs. And I know we talk about how the SATs are culturally biased. Yeah, I know they are. But I hate to tell you, but the university is culturally biased. Those tests measured probability of success in undergraduate school, or did before they started monkeying with them. And it was important. I knew because of my board scores that I had a probability of success, and I knew what it was. It wasn't 100%, I got news for you. But it was enough to make sure that I knew that I had a chance. Those things are important. I want to talk briefly about something that we all remember. That was all private stuff. This is the stuff we all remember. The first night orientation. Do you remember this?
I do.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to read you from the. By the way, there's something called the DP Online. You can go online to the archives and you can read all the old editions of the DP. It's a frightening exercise, and you think those pictures are strange. This is what the DP said. After an afternoon reception for students and parents and an all-freshman picnic, students gathered for the panel discussion presented by campus leaders on the week's theme, Student Involvement and Responsibility. The presentation represented a revamping of last year's first night when freshmen attended Traditions Night, an evening of university sports flicks and student and school cheers. New Student Week was intended to get away from that social gung-ho spirit, Colby Smith, Assistant Dean of Men, said. We wanted to focus on something other than the band playing. The students were really upset by some of the discussions, Smith continued. Many of the boys came back to the dorms still discussing it. My recollection of that was sitting in the balcony of Irvine Auditorium. I sat in the balcony by choice. There wasn't looking down at this stage on which there were a whole bunch of white people and one black person. White people represented CIC. Ira Harkavy was there. You don't remember this, do you? Yeah.
You forget a lot of things now.
Oh, okay. Well, I remember you had hair. But they were talking about student involvement with this in the community and that and the other thing. And the one guy, black guy, got up and he represented the students, the Society of African and African American Students. And he was angry, and he was militant, and he scared the shit out of me. Scared the shit out of everybody, as a matter of fact. He was telling people, don't go north of 40th, beyond north of Lancaster Avenue or west of 40th Street, and I'm looking around, and all these people were looking at me. And I'm saying, well, I'm scared too. In a question and answer session, I went down and I asked the question. And the question was, do you really think you can end white racism with black racism? There was a little further discussion at that point, and I had an exit line. I stole it from a novel. I am not a black American. I'm an American who happens to be black. I thought about journeys when I was writing the beginning of an essay the other day, rewriting it for about the 14th time.